So today, we're going to dive into something really fascinating. It's a story about what happens when the law draws a firm line, but politics, well, politics just decides to keep pushing. We're going to unpack this whole idea of judicial exhaustion using the incredible and incredibly complex history of reservation policies in India.
In this, right here is the question at the very heart of it. I mean, think about it. What actually happens when a court, trying to follow constitutional principles, draws a line in the sand, but it comes up against a political force that is just relentless, an unstoppable object? That's the conflict we're getting into today. In any constitutional system, you can think of the courts as the ultimate referees. Their job isn't to pick a side or decide who wins the game. It's to make sure that the fundamental rules, these core principles like equality, don't just get thrown out the window when the political pressure gets really, really intense. They're the custodians. So it's really important to frame this story correctly. This is not a tale of a court just giving up or throwing in the towel. No, it's something way more subtle. It's about a court trying to contain and manage a powerful force, only to be slowly, gradually but surely, overwhelmed by a political will that just never, ever let up. Okay, so you have to understand, the goal of the Indian judiciary was never to block policies meant to correct historical injustices, what we often call affirmative action. Not at all. The real goal was to discipline them, to create a set of clear limits or guardrails to make sure that this powerful exception didn't end up swallowing the fundamental rule. And that brings us to the absolute foundational idea that guided the court's thinking for decades. It's this: equality is the rule, reservation is the exception. Now, that might sound simple, but it wasn't just a turn of phrase. It was a deep, structural argument about how the whole system was designed to work. The default setting is equality for all. All right, so let's talk about those guardrails. The first one, and definitely the most famous one, was a numbers game, the 50% cap. Basically, this meant that reserved spots, whether in schools or government jobs, couldn't take up more than half of the total seats available. But here's the thing, it's not really about the number 50 itself. The logic behind it is what's so crucial. The court saw 50% as a constitutional boundary. It was that line in the sand. If you go beyond it, they argued, the exception, reservation, starts to completely overwhelm the rule of equality. It changes the very fabric of the system. So the second guardrail was less about numbers and more about people. It was called the creamy layer doctrine. The idea here is pretty straightforward. Within groups that are eligible for reservation, if a family has already become successful, they're advanced socially, educationally, economically, then they should be excluded from getting those benefits. The whole purpose was to create a kind of exit ramp so that this corrective measure didn't just become a permanent hereditary advantage passed down through generations. And the third and final guardrail was all about conditionality. The courts basically said, look, reservation isn't a blank check. If the government wants to implement it, especially in tricky areas like promotions, they have to prove their case. They need hard data showing that a community is still facing disadvantages, evidence that they're not adequately represented, and they have to show that these policies won't mess with the overall efficiency of the administration. So there you have it. The court sets up these clear, principled boundaries. But what happens next? Well, politics pushes back, and it pushes back hard. For every single limit that judiciary put in place, a powerful and persistent political reaction was waiting. And this is where that pressure really starts to build. This slide just lays out the dynamic perfectly. Look at how this worked. The court's 50% cap, it gets reframed politically as a denial of justice. The creamy layer idea to exclude the well-off, that's painted as an attack on identity. And that requirement for data and justification? Nope, that's just an obstacle to progress. You can see how this reframing just completely changes the conversation and raises the political stakes through the roof. So this put the judiciary in a truly impossible bind. I mean, what do you do? Do you stand firm, enforce your limits, and risk this massive head-on collision with the government, which could damage your own authority? Or do you pull back a little, moderate your approach, and try to preserve your legitimacy for the long haul? What happened next is what this whole story is really about. It's what the source material calls a slow retreat. It wasn't a sudden surrender. It was this gradual, subtle shift away from enforcing those hard principles and toward just overseeing procedures. And this, right here, is the key takeaway. The courts never actually came out and said, we were wrong, our old rulings are overturned. The 50% cap, the creamy layer, technically, those principles are all still on the books. But in the real world, in practice, the judiciary just adjusted. It was this quiet but profound act of institutional self-preservation. So let's break down what that adjustment actually looked like. In theory, in the legal documents, all the principles were constantly being reaffirmed. But in practice, how they were applied got narrower and narrower. So yeah, the 50% cap doctrine survives, but its enforcement gets a lot weaker, with more exceptions. The creamy layer idea is still considered good law, but its application is spotty at best, and those conditions for justification, they're still there, but they rarely end up constraining the final political outcome.
Let's go back to that referee metaphor. Think about it. If a ref in the middle of a game just stops calling fouls consistently, or stops caring if players step out of bounds, the players don't just stop playing. Of course not. They adapt. They learn very quickly that those lines on the field are now more like suggestions than actual rules. And that is exactly what happened here.
So where does this all lead? What's the long-term, quiet consequence of this judicial deference? Well, the entire system begins to harden into a new shape. First, the most immediate result is that the last neutral arbiter in the game, the referee, has, for all practical purposes, stepped back from meaningfully enforcing the boundaries. But the second consequence, and this one might be much deeper, is what it does to public trust. When people see day after day that the rules are being bent or applied selectively or not at all, their belief in the law as a fair and impartial force just starts to weaken. It erodes. And this brings us to the final, really powerful takeaway from this whole journey. On one hand, you have the Constitution, this incredible document that still speaks in the grand, aspirational language of equality and principle. But what society actually hears and experiences on the ground is something very different. It's not principle, it's management. The law starts to be seen less as a set of ideals we should all strive for, and more as just a complex system for managing the competing interests of different groups. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. We often imagine our institutions failing in some loud, explosive crisis, a big bang. But this story suggests something else, something quieter. It forces us to ask, what happens when a system doesn't break all at once, but instead just fractures, slowly, silently, from the inside out?